Chapter 1. It was a strange story which we heard in that old house on the night before Christmas. We sat by the fire and listened silently until the end. Then somebody said, "How unusual. It's the first time that I've ever heard about a child who saw a ghost." I could see that Douglas wanted to say something. After a few seconds, he spoke. It's not the only time that a child has seen a ghost. A ghost story with one child in it is frightening enough. But two children who see ghosts, isn't that quite strange? Doesn't that give the story another turn of the screw? Of course, somebody answered. Two children give two turns of the screw. We want to hear the story. Douglas looked at all of us and said quietly, "It's a terrible story. It is the most frightening story that I know." "Then begin at once," I said. "I can't. It's in a book which is locked in my desk at home. I can ask my servant to put it in the post." "Oh, yes, please do." Everyone asked him to hurry. "Is it your story?" I asked him. No. I heard it from a woman. I've never forgotten it. She wrote it down, and when she died, it came to me. She was 10 years older than me. She was my sister's governess when I was a student at university. In the summer holidays, I talked to her a lot. Yes, don't smile. She was beautiful. She was also clever and interesting, and I liked her very much. I think she liked me too. It was 40 years ago, but I remember everything. Did she tell any others her story? No. She said that I was the first person to hear it. The packet arrived in the post 2 days later. We all wanted to hear the story, and we sat down ready after dinner that evening. Before Douglas read the story to us, he told us about the young woman. She was 20 years old. She came from a poor church family, and she decided to work as a governess. She heard about a man who wanted to employ a governess for 2 children. She went to London and met him at his large house in Harley Street. They were his brother's children. His brother was dead, and now he had to look after them. The man was handsome, rich, and unmarried, and the young woman was immediately in love with him. "I'll be so pleased if you can take the job," he told her. "London isn't a good place for children. I've taken them to my family home in Essex. It's a large house with big gardens and a park. I have no time to look after them. I've sent my best servants there, and the housekeeper, Mrs. Gross, is a very good woman. You will like her, I'm sure." He was very worried about the children, a little girl and her older brother. Not long ago, their first governess died suddenly, and now their uncle had to employ a new governess quickly. He had to find the right person. The boy was away at school, but he came back in the holidays, and the little girl was home all the time. "How did the first governess die?" a listener asked Douglas. "Was the job dangerous?" "You will hear everything," he answered. The young lady did not give her answer at once. It was her first job, and the house was big and almost empty. The money was good, but could she be happy there, alone? She wanted to help this wonderful man, but could she look after the children well enough? She returned to the house in Harley Street 2 days later. "I have decided to take the job," she said. "Her love for her new master," somebody said. Yes, of course. This love helped her later. It helped her to be brave, Douglas continued. But her employer said, "There's one thing that you must promise me. You must never bring any problem to me. You must never write to me. You must decide everything." She promised. He took her hand. He was so pleased with her. She never saw him again. Douglas opened the red book on his knee and began to read the governess's story to us. Chapter 2. I was very worried during the journey. Was I making a mistake? I was going alone to a strange house to teach 2 children that I did not know. But it was a beautiful day, and when I arrived, the house was a pleasant surprise. It was large, but light, with open windows and bright flowers in the gardens. And Flora was the most beautiful child that I have ever seen. Her hair was gold in color, and her dress was blue. She and Mrs. Gross, the housekeeper, were there to meet me. Mrs. Gross seemed to be a kind, good woman, and at supper that evening I asked her about Miles, the boy. "If you like this little girl, you will like the boy too," she said. She smiled at Flora, and Flora smiled at us both. "He's so clever." "When will I see him? Tomorrow?" "No, the day after." I was very excited that night and did not sleep much. I heard some small sounds in the house. Perhaps someone was awake. My room was large and comfortable. There was a little bed in it for Flora, but on my first night she slept with Mrs. Gross. I woke up with the birds and looked forward to my first full day with her. Flora showed me everything in the house and garden. She showed me the secret places, the old stairs, the empty rooms. After half an hour, we were good friends. Perhaps, I thought, I'm in some wonderful story. But no, it's real, and it will be an adventure for me. I remembered my promise to my employer that evening. A letter came from Miles's school. I was not excited now, but worried. The head at the school wrote that Miles could not go back there again. "They won't take him back," I told Mrs. Gross. "Never?" she asked, surprised. "Never. Here, you can read the letter." I gave it to her, but she shook her head sadly. "I cannot read," she said. "What has he done?" She was almost crying. "They don't say. But they think that he's dangerous to the other children." "Dangerous?" Mrs. Gross was angry now. "Is he a bad child?" "He's only 10 years old. How can he be bad? Is she bad?" She pointed at Flora, who was sitting quietly at the table. The little girl was writing, practicing her letter O's. "Naughty, then?" I asked her. "Oh, yes, of course he is sometimes naughty, but every boy must be naughty sometimes." "Yes, a boy who is not naughty is not a boy for me." Later, before Miles arrived, I asked her about the last governess. "What kind of lady was she?" "She was young and pretty like you." "Was she careful with the boy?" "With some things, yes. But perhaps not with everything. But she's dead now, so I mustn't speak badly of her." "Yes, of course," I said quickly. "Was she ill? Did she die here?" "No, she went for a holiday. Then she died. The master told me." "How did she die?" "He didn't say. And she would not tell me anymore. Miles was as beautiful as his sister. I loved him too, as soon as I saw him. He had a sweet innocence, and I could not understand the school's letter. "He can't be bad. It's not possible," I said to Mrs. Gross later. "Look at him." "Yes, I look at him all the time," she smiled. "What will you do?" "I won't answer the letter. I can't write to his uncle, and I won't speak to Miles about it." "Good," Mrs. Gross said. "Then together we'll be friends to the two children." She kissed me like a sister. Chapter 3. I did not give the children many lessons during those first weeks. Perhaps they were teaching me now. They were teaching me to laugh, to play, to be free. I was more innocent than the children. I know that now. In the evenings, when they were in bed, I liked to walk among the summer flowers in the gardens and under the old trees in the park. Sometimes I could see the face of my employer in front of my eyes. "He's smiling at me," I thought. "He's pleased with me. I'm looking after the children well for him." One evening in June, I walked about 3 miles through the park. When I came back to the house, I looked up and saw a face. Was it my employer's face, which I thought about so much? No, it was not. I realized that very quickly. A man stood on the roof of the tower. There were 2 towers, one at each end of the roof. Each tower had a room inside, and you could climb out onto the roof from them. Flora took me there on my first day. I did not know this man. I saw him very clearly, and he was watching me. He stood still and stared at me for a minute, then turned away. I was frightened. Was there a secret in this old house? I wanted to ask Mrs. Gross, but when I came back into the house, everything seemed quite ordinary again. I did not say anything to her, but for many days I thought about it. Finally, I decided. It was a stranger who found a way into the house, but he's gone now, so I can forget him. I won't worry about it. I preferred to enjoy my days with the children. I was never bored with them. They were happy, and they made me happy too. I did not think about my family at home now. Flora and Miles were my family, and this was my home. One Sunday, in the early evening, Mrs. Gross and I decided to go to church together. My bag was in the dining room, and I went in there to get it. Suddenly, I looked up and saw a face at the window. It was staring at me through the glass. It was the man who I saw on the roof. I stared at him. He stared at me. I did not know him, but I felt strangely that I knew him very well. Then he looked round the room. He's looking for someone, but not for me, I realized. Then I felt brave. I ran outside and looked for him, but he was not there. The garden was empty. I went back to the window, put my face against the glass, and stared in. Mrs. Gross walked into the dining room and saw me. She turned white and came outside to meet me. Why is she frightened? I asked myself. What's the matter? She asked me. Your face is white. You look terrible. My face? I said. I was frightened. You saw my face at the window, but when I was in the dining room, I saw a man's face in the same place. Who is he? Where has he gone? I have no idea. Have you seen him before? Yes, once. He was standing on the roof of the tower. And you didn't tell me? What was he doing there? He looked at me, that's all. He was a stranger, a dreadful man. Mrs. Gross looked out over the gardens once more, then said, "Well, it's time for church now." "No, I can't go to church. Not now. I can't leave the children. It's not safe." "It isn't safe?" she asked. "He's dangerous," I replied. She realized something then. I could see it in her face. "What did he look like?" she asked. "He is like nobody." "What do you mean?" "He has no hat." She looked worried, so I continued quickly. "He has red hair and a long face, with strange eyes." Mrs. Gross's mouth was open, and she stared at me. "Is he handsome? How is he dressed?" "Oh, yes, he's handsome, and he's wearing another person's clothes." "The master's," she said. "You know this man?" She did not reply for a second. Then she answered, "Quint, Peter Quint. He was the master's servant. He took some of his clothes, but never his hat. When the master left, Quint looked after everything in the house. He was only a servant, but he gave the orders." "Then where did he go?" "Go?" she said. "Oh no, he died." "Died?" I almost screamed. "Yes," she said. "Peter Quint is dead." Chapter 4. Mrs. Gross and I talked a lot about Quint's ghost. "I have never seen anything," she said, but she knew my story was true. "Who was he looking for?" she asked me. "He was looking for little Miles," I said, because I knew that it was true. Mrs. Gross looked frightened. "The child?" she asked. "His ghost wants to find the children." "How do you know?" I know. And you know too, don't you?" She did not answer, so I continued. "Miles never speaks about Quint. Isn't that strange? He says nothing to me." "They were great friends, Miles and Quint, you told me." "It was Quint's idea," Mrs. Gross said. "He wanted to play with Miles all the time. He was too free with him." "Too free!" "He was too free with my boy. This was terrible. He was too free with everyone." "So he was truly a bad man?" "I knew it, but the master didn't. He didn't like to hear about any sort of trouble. I couldn't tell him. I was afraid." "What were you afraid of?" "Quint was so clever. He could do terrible things." "A dreadful man, with those innocent little children. Couldn't you do something?" I couldn't say anything. Peter Quint gave the orders. She began to cry. "Did Mrs. Gross tell me everything?" "No. There was something that she didn't say. I had to be brave. I had to watch carefully. The children must not meet this ghost." And then, one afternoon, I took Flora out into the garden. Miles was reading inside, so Flora and I walked down to the lake together. It was hot, and we walked under the trees for much of the time. When we arrived at the lake, I sat down with a book, and for an hour everything was quiet. Suddenly I thought, someone is watching us? But I did not look up at once. I looked at Flora first. She had stopped playing and was very still. She can see the person too, I thought. Then she turned away quickly from the lake. Now I had to look up. A woman was standing on the other side of the lake, a dreadful woman, dressed in black. She was staring at Flora. I knew that she was the ghost of Miss Jessel, the children's old governess. Flora saw her too, I told Mrs. Gross later. Did she tell you? Mrs. Gross asked. No, and that makes it more terrible. The woman has come for Flora. The way she looks at her. Mrs. Gross turned white. She was dressed in black? Yes, and she was handsome. She was a beautiful woman, but a bad one. They were both bad, she said at last. You must tell me about them now, I said. They were together, she said. They were lovers, but she paid a terrible price for it. Yes, she suffered, poor woman. He did what he wanted. With her? With them all. How did she die? I don't know. I didn't want to know. But she couldn't stay in the house after that. She had to leave. She was a lady, and he was only a servant. And Peter Quint? How did he die? He drank too much one night. He came out of the bar in the village and fell down on the ice. He cut his head on a stone. Well, that's what people say. Nobody really knows. It's all so terrible. And now I began to cry, and Mrs. Gross took me in her arms. We can't save the children. They're lost. Lost. But I still wanted to be with the children most of all, especially with Flora. She looked into my face carefully with her big blue eyes and said, You were crying. She was so sweet, so innocent. How could she know about these dreadful things? And Miles, I asked Mrs. Gross about Miles. He was sometimes bad, you said to me. How was he bad? Naughty, she replied. I said naughty, not bad. Please tell me, I continued. He's always so good with me. So when he was bad or naughty, it was unusual. What happened? We were talking late into the night, and now the gray light of morning was coming. Mrs. Gross was silent for a minute. Then she answered me. Quint and the boy were together all the time. I didn't like it. I spoke to Miss Jessel about it. She was angry with me. It's none of your business, she said. So I spoke to Miles. You told him that Peter Quint was only a servant? Yes. You're only a servant too, he answered me. And there were times when he and Peter Quint were together for hours, but he said, I haven't seen Peter today. He lied to you? Mrs. Gross seemed surprised by this word. Yes, perhaps he did. And he knew about Quint and Miss Jessel? I don't know. Yes, you do know, and we need to know more.